The security camera footage was crystal clear. Karen Henderson marching across what she thought was an abandoned lot, bolt cutters in hand, ready to claim her rightful property. But as she snipped through the first fence, shadows moved in the tree-lined men in tactical gear, laser sights dancing across her designer blazer. She had 30 seconds before discovering that her latest crusade for justice had led her straight into the crosshairs of an active FBI counterterrorism exercise. The irony was delicious. The consequences would be devastating. The morning sun cast long shadows across the disputed patch of land as Karen Henderson stood at her kitchen window, steam rising from her third cup of coffee. Her manicured fingers drummed against the granite countertop, each tap echoing her mounting frustration. For 6 months, she'd been fighting the city, the county, and anyone else who would listen about the eyesore next to her pristine suburban home. 17 acres of prime real estate, she muttered to her reflection in the window, just sitting there like some post-apocalyptic wasteland. The property in question stretched beyond her perfectly maintained backyard, a sprawling expanse of overgrown grass punctuated by concrete barriers and chain-link fencing. To Karen's discerning eye, it was nothing more than an abandoned lot that some bureaucratic oversight had left to rot. She'd done her research, or thought she had. Public records showed the land had been transferred between various government agencies, lost in a maze of paperwork that would make a normal person give up. But Karen Henderson was not normal people. She'd built her reputation in Millbrook Heights as the woman who got things done. HOA president for 8 consecutive years, she'd eliminated lawn violations, enforced parking restrictions with military precision, and personally ensured that every mailbox met the community's exacting standards. The neighbors either feared her or respected her, sometimes both, but they all knew that when Karen set her sights on something, resistance was futile. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Henderson residence. Mrs. Henderson, this is Deputy Clerk Martinez from the County Assessor's Office. You've been calling about the evergreen parcel? Karen's spine straightened. The abandoned lot adjacent, 247 Maple Ridge Drive? Yes, I've been trying to get answers for months about why that property isn't being maintained or developed. Ma'am, I've been looking into your requests, and I have to tell you the records are complicated. That land has been under federal jurisdiction since 2019, but the specific department classification is sealed. Sealed? Karen's voice could have cut glass? Under what authority? I'm not at liberty to say, but Mrs. Henderson, I'd strongly advise against any direct action regarding that property. Sometimes these federal designations exist for very specific reasons. The line went dead, leaving Karen staring at her phone in disbelief. In her 42 years, no bureaucrat had ever hung up on her. The audacity was breathtaking. She walked to her home office, a shrined organization where color-coded files held documentation of every neighborhood battle she'd ever fought. Her evergreen property folder had grown thick with printed emails, property surveys, and photographs documenting what she saw as municipal negligence. Karen pulled up the county's online property database, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The evergreen parcel showed a last sale date of March 15, 2019, to something called North Point Holdings LLC, a company that, according to her previous research, didn't seem to exist beyond a Delaware incorporation filing. Shell company, she said aloud, her investigative instincts sharpening. Someone's hiding ownership to avoid property taxes or liability. Her doorbell chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw her next-door neighbor, David Chen, shifting nervously on her front porch. David was a software engineer who kept to himself, the kind of quiet neighbor Karen appreciated until now. David, she said, opening the door with a forced smile. What can I do for you? Mrs. Henderson, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you been making inquiries about the property behind our houses? Karen's eyes narrowed. Why would you ask that? David glanced around nervously. Yesterday evening, 2 men in suits came to my door, asking if anyone in the neighborhood had been asking questions about federal property. They seemed very interested when I mentioned you'd been taking pictures and measurements near the fence. Lying the news hit Karen like a physical blow. Federal agents asking about her. The very idea was preposterous. She was a law-abiding citizen, exercising her rights to understand what was happening in her own neighborhood. Did they identify themselves? She asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. FBI, David said quietly. They left cards and asked me to call if I noticed any unusual activity related to the property. Mrs. Henderson, maybe you should. Thank you for the information. David, Karen's tone indicated the conversation was over. I'll handle this. As she closed the door, Karen's mind raced. FBI involvement suggested something more serious than abandoned property. But what? Drug activity? Environmental contamination? Or was this simply another case of federal bureaucracy run amok? She returned to her office and opened a new browser window. If the government wanted to play games, she'd play by their rules, but she'd win. Karen had never lost a property dispute, and she wasn't about to start now. Her research that afternoon yielded frustrating dead ends. North Point Holdings LLC had no website, no business filings beyond its initial incorporation, and no listed employees. The property's previous owner, according to records going back 20 years, had been the Department of Defense, which had sold it to a private contractor in 2019. As the sun began to set, Karen made a decision that would change everything. She would conduct her own survey of the property, not trespassing. Of course, she would stay on the public right-of-way and document everything she could see. If federal agents wanted to intimidate her neighbors, they'd find that Karen Henderson didn't intimidate. She gathered her equipment, digital camera with telephoto lens, measuring tape, GPS device, and a small pair of bolt cutters just in case she needed to clear away some overgrown vegetation near the fence line to get better photographs. She, dressed practically in dark jeans and a navy windbreaker, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. The walk to the rear of her property took less than 2 minutes. Karen had made this journey dozens of times over the past months, but tonight felt different. The familiar sounds of suburban evening lawn mowers, children playing, dogs barking seemed muted, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The chain-link fence separating her property from the federal land stood 8 feet tall, topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. Beyond it, the terrain was exactly as she remembered. Tall grass, scattered concrete barriers, and what appeared to be the remnants of old buildings in the distance. Nothing that looked actively maintained or particularly sensitive. Karen began, photographing the fence line, documenting gaps in the chain link and areas where vegetation had grown over the barriers. Through her camera lens, she spotted something she'd missed before: tire tracks in the dirt. Recent ones that suggested regular vehicle access despite the property's apparently abandoned state. Her investigative instincts fully engaged, Karen moved along the fence, photographing everything. Near the northeast corner of her property, she discovered a section where the fence had been damaged, leaving a gap large enough for a person to walk through. The metal had been cut cleanly, not damaged by weather or accident. This was the evidence she needed. Someone was accessing the property regularly, which meant it wasn't truly abandoned. If squatters or drug dealers were using federal land for illegal activities, that would explain the FBI's interest and justify her own investigation. Karen checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. Full darkness had settled over the neighborhood, providing perfect cover for reconnaissance. She approached the gap in the fence, her heart pounding with the thrill of finally making progress on the case that had consumed her for months. The gap was wider than it had appeared from a distance. Karen slipped through easily, her bolt cutters catching momentarily on the chain link before she freed them. She was now officially on federal property, but she reasoned that documenting illegal activity took precedence over technical trespassing. The grass was shorter on the federal side of the fence, recently mowed despite the property's supposed abandonment. Karen crouched low and began moving toward the concrete barriers she'd observed from her backyard, camera ready to document whatever evidence of illegal activity she might find. She'd made it perhaps 50 yards when the first spotlight hit her. The beam was so bright it turned night into day, eliminating every shadow and revealing Karen in perfect detail. She froze, momentarily blinded, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Freeze. FBI, do not move. The voice came from multiple directions simultaneously, amplified by electronic megaphones. Karen spun toward the sound, her eyes beginning to adjust to the light, and felt her blood turn to ice. Men in full tactical gear were emerging from positions she hadn't even known existed. They moved with military precision, automatic weapons trained on her, red laser sights creating a constellation of dots across her navy windbreaker. How many weeks? The FBI field office in downtown Richmond felt like a concrete tomb. At 2:47 a.m., Karen Henderson sat in interview room C, her designer windbreaker replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her small frame. The zip tie marks on her wrists had faded to angry red welts, but the humiliation burned brighter with each passing hour. Special Agent Rebecca Torres entered with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. She was younger than Karen had expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and an air of competence that immediately put Karen on edge. Mrs. Henderson, I'm Agent Torres. I'll be handling your case. She slid 1 coffee across the metal table. Before we begin, I want you to understand the severity of your situation. Karen straightened in her plastic chair, channeling every ounce of authority she'd wielded as HOA president. Agent Torres, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding. I was investigating what I believed to be an abandoned property adjacent to my home. I had no knowledge that it was federal land. Torres opened the folder and spread photographs across the table. Karen's stomach dropped as she recognized her own handwriting on legal pads. Her annotated property surveys, printed emails to county officials, and most damning telephoto shots of the training facility taken from her backyard over the past 6 months. These were recovered from your home office during the search warrant execution an hour ago, Torres said calmly. Mrs. Henderson, you conducted 6 months of surveillance on a classified federal training facility. You documented security protocols, photographed personnel movements, and attempted to breach the perimeter with bolt cutters. I was trying to figure out who owned the property. Karen's voice cracked with desperation. The public records were deliberately obscured. Yes, they were. For national security reasons. Torres pulled out a document marked with red classification stamps. The Evergreen Training Complex houses counterterrorism exercises for multiple federal agencies. The security protocols you documented are classified at the secret level. Your photographs captured federal agents in training scenarios that simulate real-world operations against domestic and international threats. Karen stared at the classified document, her mind reeling. I had no way of knowing you called the county assessor's office 47 times in 6 months. Torres interrupted, consulting her notes. You filed Freedom of Information Act requests with 3 different agencies. You hired a private investigator to research ownership records. Mrs. Henderson, when someone tells you that information is classified and to stop digging, the appropriate response isn't to dig harder. The private investigator, Karen had forgotten about Marcus Delano, the ex-cop she'd hired to trace the ownership of North Point Holdings, LLC. He'd warned her that his inquiries were hitting federal roadblocks, but she'd pushed him to continue. Where is Marcus? She asked suddenly. Marcus Delano is he. Mr. Delano is in custody at a separate facility. Torres said, his surveillance of federal personnel and attempts to penetrate classified databases constitute more serious charges than yours. He's looking at potential espionage violations. The room seemed to spin around Karen. Marcus, a man she'd hired to help protect her neighborhood, was facing espionage charges because of her obsession with the property dispute. The weight of responsibility crushed down on her shoulders. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered. Torres leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. Mrs. Henderson, I believe you. Your background check shows a woman who's spent her life fighting for her community. PA president, volunteer firefighter auxiliary, church treasurer. You're not a spy or a terrorist. But intent doesn't erase impact. Karen looked up, hope flickering in her chest. So you'll let me go home? I'm afraid it's not that simple. Torres pulled out another document. Your breach occurred during an active training exercise simulating a terrorist infiltration of a government facility. 23 federal agents were conducting a hostage rescue scenario when you appeared on their thermal imaging systems. For 17 minutes, they believed you were a hostile combatant attempting to plant an explosive device. The coffee turned to acid in Karen's stomach. They thought I was a terrorist. The team leader called for lethal authorization. Torres continued relentlessly. Mrs. Henderson, you came within 30 seconds of being shot by a federal sniper who had you in his crosshairs. The only reason you're alive is because Agent Mitchell recognized your suburban clothing and realized you might be a civilian. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. She'd been 30 seconds from death, and she'd never even known she was in danger. The tactical team, the spotlights, the weapons trained on her hit, hadn't been an overreaction to simple trespassing. They'd genuinely believed she was there to kill people. The charges against you are federal, Torres said, merging back into official mode. Criminal trespass on classified federal property, attempted destruction of government security infrastructure, and interference with federal law enforcement operations. The minimum sentence is 18 months in federal prison. The maximum is 15 years. 15 years. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. For trying to clean up my neighborhood, for conducting extended surveillance of a classified facility, and attempting to breach its security during an active operation, Torres corrected. Mrs. Henderson, 3 congressmen sit on the Intelligence Oversight Committee that reviews this facility's operations. Your photographs and documentation could compromise ongoing investigations into actual terrorist threats. The door opened, admitting a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. He was tall, silver-haired, and radiated the kind of authority that made Karen's HOA presidency look like a children's game. Agent Torres, he said with a nod. Mrs. Henderson, I'm Assistant Director James Petrov, FBI Counterterrorism Division. I've been monitoring your case since your arrest. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. The FBI's assistant director didn't monitor simple trespassing cases. This was bigger than she'd realized. Sir, Torres said, standing, I was just explaining the charges to Mrs. Henderson. Sit down, Agent Torres. Mrs. Henderson, your case has attracted attention at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Do you know why? Karen shook her head, not trusting her voice. Because your actions have revealed a significant security vulnerability in one of our most sensitive training facilities, Petrov said, taking the chair across from her. A suburban homeowner with no intelligence training and no federal resources managed to document our security protocols, identify personnel patterns, and breach our perimeter. If you could do it, so could actual terrorists. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Karen felt the weight of unintended consequences crushing down on her. Her quest to improve her neighborhood had exposed weaknesses that real enemies could exploit. The good news, Petrov continued, is that you've helped us identify problems we need to fix. The bad news is that fixing those problems will require relocating the entire training complex at a cost of approximately $47 million. Karen's mouth fell open. 47 million, new location, new facilities, new security protocols, all because a concerned citizen proved that our current setup is fundamentally compromised. Mrs. Henderson, you've accidentally conducted the most successful intelligence operation against federal law enforcement in Virginia's history. Irony was staggering. Karen Henderson, defender of suburban order, had struck a blow against federal security that professional spies could only dream of achieving, and she'd done it all with a camera, a measuring tape, and an unshakable belief in her right to know what was happening in her neighborhood. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Petrov exchanged a look with Torres. That depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate with our security review. We need to understand exactly how you identified our vulnerabilities, what information you gathered, and who else might have access to your documentation. You want me to help you? Karen couldn't hide her disbelief. Mrs. Henderson, you've demonstrated a remarkable talent for intelligence gathering and operational security analysis, Petrov said. Your methods were unorthodox and illegal, but they were also effective. We'd like to understand how a civilian managed to outmaneuver federal security protocols. Karen stared at the assistant director, trying to process what he was suggesting. After 18 hours of terror, arrest, and the threat of 15 years in prison, the FBI wanted her help. The same obsessive attention to detail that had landed her in federal custody might also be her ticket out. But as she looked at the photographs spread across the table, evidence of her months-long surveillance operation, Karen realized that her fight for neighborhood improvement had transformed into something far more dangerous. She'd proven that federal security could be compromised by suburban determination, and now she had to live with the consequences of that discovery. The woman who'd never lost a property dispute was about to learn that some victories came with a price too high to pay. Karen Henderson's release from federal custody came with strings attached, invisible chains that bound her more tightly than any prison cell ever could. The ankle monitor felt heavy against her bone as she sat in her pristine living room 72 hours later, staring at the cooperation agreement that would determine the next 5 years of her life. The document was 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple proposition: help the FBI understand how she'd compromised their security and avoid 15 years in federal prison, refuse, and face trial as a domestic terrorist who had penetrated classified government facilities. Her husband Michael paced behind the couch like a caged animal, his corporate lawyer instincts warring with his protective husband impulses. They'd been married for 19 years, and she'd never seen him this rattled. Karen, you need to understand what you're agreeing to, he said for the 5th time in an hour. This isn't consulting work. You'd be a federal informant with security clearance. Your life would belong to the government, as opposed to spending the next decade and a half in a federal penitentiary. Karen's voice carried an edge of hysteria she couldn't quite suppress. Michael, I photographed classified operations. They have evidence of 6 months of surveillance. My choices are cooperation or prison. The doorbell interrupted their argument. Through the window, Karen saw Agent Torres standing on her front porch with a man she didn't recognize. Older, wearing a rumpled suit that had seen too many late nights and too much coffee. Mrs. Henderson, Torres said when Karen opened the door. This is Agent William Rourke from our Behavioral Analysis Unit. He specializes in civilian security assessments. Rourke looked like he'd stepped out of a police procedural. Face, graying beard, eyes that had seen too much human nature and found most of it wanting. He studied Karen with the intensity of an entomologist examining a particularly interesting insect. Mrs. Henderson, I've spent the last 3 days studying your surveillance operation, he said without preamble. Impressive work, methodical, thorough, professionally documented. Where did you learn intelligence gathering techniques? Karen blinked in confusion. I didn't. I was just ... organized. Organized. Rourke pulled out a tablet and scrolled through digital copies of her documentation. You identified vehicle rotation patterns, documented personnel shift changes, mapped security camera blind spots, and created detailed architectural assessments of classified structures. That's not organization, Mrs. Henderson. That's operational intelligence. Michael stepped forward protectively. My wife is a community volunteer, not a spy. Rourke's laugh held no humor. Mr. Henderson, your wife conducted a more thorough security assessment of our facility than our own contractors performed during the initial setup. She identified vulnerabilities that professional security consultants missed, and she did it using nothing but consumer-grade equipment and suburban persistence. Torres spread a map across Karen's coffee table. Mrs. Henderson, we need you to walk us through your methodology. How did you identify the access routes? What made you focus on the northeastern perimeter? Karen found herself drawn into the familiar rhythm of explanation, the same tone she'd used during countless HOA presentations. The northeastern corner had different vegetation patterns. The grass was shorter, more trampled. Vehicle access has to follow existing paths. You can't drive heavy equipment through virgin forest without leaving permanent traces. And the personnel patterns, Rourke prompted. Shift changes happened at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., but the evening shift was smaller, probably skeleton crew for overnight security. The morning shift brought more vehicles, which suggested either equipment, maintenance, or expanded operations during daylight hours. As she spoke, Karen watched both agents take notes. The surreal nature of the situation hit her. She was briefing federal agents on how she'd spied on federal agents. Her obsessive attention to detail, the same trait that made her such an effective HOA president, had transformed her into an accidental intelligence operative. "The private investigator you hired," Torres said, consulting her notes. "Marcus Delano. How did you select him?" Karen's stomach tightened. "He was a former police detective with experience in property disputes. I thought he could trace the ownership records more effectively than I could." "Did you direct his activities?" "I told him what I was looking for. Property ownership, lease agreements, anything that would explain why the land was abandoned." Rourke and Torres exchanged looks. "Mrs. Henderson," Rourke said carefully, "Marcus Delano wasn't just conducting property research. He was running digital surveillance on federal personnel, conducting background checks on classified employees, and attempting to penetrate secured databases. Did you request those services?" The room seemed to tilt around Karen. "No. I told him to find out who owned the property. That's all." "But you continued paying his invoices, even after he told you he was hitting federal roadblocks?" Torres pointed out. $17,000 over 4 months? "That's not property research money, Mrs. Henderson. That's intelligence gathering money." Michael stepped forward again. "Are you suggesting my wife is responsible for whatever this investigator did?" "Independently, I'm suggesting that Mrs. Henderson's single-minded pursuit of property information created a market for illegal intelligence gathering," Rourke said bluntly. "Delano saw an opportunity to bill for high-level services, because his client was clearly willing to pay for results regardless of methodology." The implication hit Karen like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't gone rogue, he'd been responding to her relentless pressure for answers. Every time she'd called demanding progress, every invoice she'd paid without questioning his methods, she'd been encouraging him to dig deeper into classified territory. "Where is Marcus now?" she asked quietly. "Federal detention pending espionage charges," Torres replied. "Mrs. Henderson, he's facing life in prison. The databases he attempted to access contained undercover agent identities and active operation details. If he'd succeeded, people would have died." Karen sank into her chair, the weight of unintended consequences crushing her. Marcus Delano, a man she'd hired to protect her neighborhood, was facing life in prison because she'd refused to accept the word no from government bureaucrats. However, Rourke continued, his cooperation with our investigation could significantly reduce his sentence, just as yours could eliminate your federal charges entirely. The carrot and the stick, presented with professional efficiency. Karen looked at Michael, seeing her own desperation reflected in his eyes. They had a choice between certain destruction and uncertain servitude. "What exactly would cooperation involve?" Michael asked. Torres pulled out another document. "Mrs. Henderson would work with our security assessment team to identify vulnerabilities in federal facilities. Her civilian perspective and unconventional methodology have proven uniquely effective at penetrating government security." "You want her to spy on other government facilities?" Michael's voice rose in disbelief. "We want her to help us understand how civilians with no intelligence training can compromise federal security," Rourke corrected. "Mrs. Henderson represents a threat profile we never considered: the determined civilian with legitimate grievances who accidentally discovers classified information through persistent investigation." Karen stared at the cooperation agreement, seeing her future mapped out in legal language. 5 years of federal service, security clearance that would control every aspect of her life, work that would take her away from the community she'd spent decades protecting. "What about my responsibilities here?" she asked. "The HOA, my volunteer work, my life." "Your life belongs to federal law enforcement now," Torres said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Henderson, you've seen classified facilities and documented classified operations. You can never return to civilian life with that knowledge." The statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen Henderson, suburban warrior and defender of community standards, had fought so hard for her neighborhood that she'd lost the right to live in it. Her phone buzzed against the coffee table. The display showed a text from her neighbor, David Chen. "Mrs. Henderson, FBI agents are interviewing everyone on the street about your research activities. What should I tell them?" Karen showed the message to Torres, who nodded grimly. "Standard security assessment. We need to determine how much classified information might have been inadvertently shared with civilians." "My neighbors." Karen's voice cracked. "You're investigating my neighbors. Everyone you spoke with about the property. Everyone who saw your photographs. Everyone who might have been exposed to classified details through casual conversation." Rourke explained. "Mrs. Henderson, you didn't conduct your surveillance operation in isolation. Community involvement was part of your methodology." The full scope of her disaster finally became clear. Karen hadn't just compromised federal security, potentially exposed her entire neighborhood to federal investigation. Friends who'd listened to her complaints about the abandoned property, neighbors who'd seen her surveillance photos, Fellow HOA members who'd supported her fight against municipal neglect, all of them, were now subjects of federal interest because of her obsessive determination to solve a property dispute. She looked around her living room. 3 months into her cooperation agreement, Karen Henderson stood in a sterile briefing room at the FBI's Quantico training facility, staring at architectural blueprints that would have been incomprehensible to her former self. The suburban housewife who'd once obsessed over mailbox height violations was now analyzing security vulnerabilities in federal courthouses, her civilian insights revealing blind spots that professional security consultants had missed for years. The visitor screening area creates a natural choke point, she explained to the assembled agents, her pointer tracing pathways on the blueprint. But the real vulnerability is here: the service entrance. Delivery schedules are predictable, security protocols are relaxed during shift changes, and the interior access bypasses 3 separate security checkpoints. Agent Rourke nodded approvingly from the back of the room. Mrs. Henderson, how long did it take you to identify that weakness? 47 minutes of public observation, Karen replied, her voice carrying the flat precision she'd developed over months of federal debrief. The patterns are visible to anyone willing to sit in a car across the street and take notes. The transformation had been rapid and thorough. Karen's obsessive attention to detail, once channeled into HOA enforcement, now served federal security assessment. She'd developed what the Bureau called civilian threat analysis, the ability to see government facilities through the eyes of ordinary citizens who might become extraordinary problems. Her handler, Agent Torres, approached after the briefing concluded. Excellent work, Karen. The courthouse security team will implement your recommendations next month. Karen had long since stopped asking Torres to use Mrs. Henderson. The formalities of her old life had evaporated along with everything else she'd once considered important. She was simply Karen now, a federal asset, with a specific skill set and no other identity that mattered. What's next? She asked, gathering her materials with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack light and travel fast. Norfolk Naval Station, full security assessment, 3-day timeline. Torres handed her a classified folder marked with familiar red stamps. This one's different, Karen. Active military facility with international implications. Your findings could affect national defense policy. Karen accepted the folder without enthusiasm. Each successful assessment took her further from the suburban life she'd lost, deeper into a world where her knowledge made her valuable and dangerous in equal measure. She'd become exactly what the government needed, a civilian who thought like a spy but couldn't return to civilian life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. HOA meeting tonight. They're voting on your replacement as president. Thought you should know. The message hit her like a physical blow. For 8 consecutive years, she'd been the undisputed leader of the Millbrook Heights Homeowners Association. She'd modernized their bylaws, eliminated property violations, and transformed their neighborhood into a model of suburban excellence. Now some stranger would sit in her chair, making decisions about the community she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Personal matter, Torres asked, noticing Karen's expression. My replacement, Karen said quietly. They're replacing me. Torres's face softened slightly, the first crack in her professional demeanor that Karen had seen in months. I know this is difficult, but you're saving lives, Karen. The security improvements you've identified have prevented 3 potential terrorist incidents that we know of. 3 potential terrorist incidents. The numbers should have made Karen proud, but it only emphasized how far she'd traveled from her former life. She was preventing attacks on federal facilities while her own neighborhood forgot she'd ever existed. That evening, Karen sat in her government-provided apartment in Quantico, watching live coverage of the HOA meeting on her neighbor David Chun's Instagram stream. Her living room, her real living room, was visible in the background, but she might as well have been looking at a museum exhibit of someone else's life. The new president was Sandra Morrison, a real estate agent who'd moved to Millbrook Heights 2 years earlier. Karen watched Sandra present a motion to modernize community standards and felt a surge of territorial rage. Sandra was undoing policies that had taken Karen years to implement, dismantling the careful structure that had maintained their neighborhood's perfection. Her landline rang, a secure federal phone that only 3 people had the number for. Karen, it's Bill Rourke. I need you in D.C. tonight. Emergency consultation. Karen checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. What kind of emergency? The kind where your expertise might prevent a catastrophic security breach? Car will pick you up in 20 minutes. The ride to FBI headquarters took 2 hours through Virginia traffic that seemed determined to delay her arrival. Karen used the time to review the Norfolk Naval Station files, but her mind kept drifting to the HOA meeting she'd watched online. Sandra Morrison had proposed changing the mailbox standards that Karen had spent 3 years perfecting. The casual destruction of her legacy felt like watching someone demolish her house brick by brick. FBI headquarters at night had the atmosphere of a hospital emergency room, fluorescent lighting, hurried conversations, and the persistent hum of urgent activity. Rourke met her at security with an expression that told her this wasn't a routine consultation. Karen, we have a problem, he said without preamble. Marcus Delano has been talking. The name hit her like ice water. Marcus, the private investigator whose life she'd destroyed through her relentless pursuit of property information, was serving a reduced sentence in federal minimum security. She'd tried not to think about him during her months of cooperation. Talking to whom? She asked. Journalists, specifically. Investigative reporters from the Washington Post and The Guardian. He's claiming that his surveillance operation was directed by a civilian who was conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering on federal facilities. Karen's legs went weak. He's blaming me. He's telling the truth, Rourke said bluntly. The problem is that his version makes you sound like a domestic intelligence operative rather than a concerned homeowner who got in over her head. If this story breaks, your cooperation agreement becomes worthless. You can't serve as a security consultant if your methods become public knowledge. They entered a conference room where Assistant Director Petrov waited with a woman Karen didn't recognize, saw auburn-haired, wearing the kind of expensive suit that suggested serious government authority. Karen, this is Deputy Attorney General Sarah Walsh, Petrov said. She's been monitoring your cooperation agreement since its inception. Walsh studied Karen with the intensity of someone evaluating a complex legal problem. Mrs. Henderson, your work with the Bureau has been exemplary. Your security assessments have identified vulnerabilities that could have resulted in significant loss of life. However, public disclosure of your methods would compromise ongoing federal security operations. What does that mean? Karen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. It means your cooperation agreement may need to be modified, Walsh said carefully. The original terms assumed your activities would remain classified indefinitely. If Marcus Delano's revelations force public disclosure, we'll need alternative arrangements for your continued security. Alternative arrangements. Karen had learned to translate government euphemisms during her months of federal service. We're talking about witness protection, complete identity change, permanent separation from any life she'd ever known. What about my husband? She asked quietly. Mr. Henderson would be relocated with you, assuming he agrees to the security protocols. Walsh replied. Full identity change, new location, new life, complete severing of ties with your previous existence. Karen stared at the conference table, seeing her reflection in its polished surface. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the HOA president who'd started photographing an abandoned lot 6 months earlier. That woman had believed in community standards, property values, and the power of persistent civic engagement. This woman understood federal security protocols, threat assessment methodology, and the weight of classified knowledge. There's another option, Petrov said into the silence. We could arrange for you to testify before a closed congressional committee about civilian security threats. Your experience would inform new legislation protecting federal facilities from inadvertent compromise. It would require complete disclosure of your methods and findings, but it would legitimize your cooperation and protect you from criminal prosecution if Delano's story becomes public. Congressional testimony? Karen's voice cracked with exhaustion. I'd be testifying against my own neighborhood. Everything I did to protect my community would become evidence of how civilians can threaten national security. You'd be testifying for national security, Walsh corrected. Mrs. Henderson, you've accidentally pioneered a new form of intelligence gathering that our enemies could replicate. Your testimony would help us develop countermeasures. Karen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Congressional testimony would make her a public figure forever associated with domestic security threats. Witness protection would erase her identity completely. Continued cooperation under her current agreement would trap her in